You got 3 eyes.
Jesus Christ, pretty catchy little cowbell. Oh, these guys need to fuck off, man.
I'm Jordan Peterson.
First thing I'd like to point out is that our retreat so far, about 30 minutes from trans people, right? certain levels from transsexual people. Some of the people whose voices are not being heard today are actually members of the transsexual community that happen to agree with me. And we've not with them. That is the case of a single transsexual person can't speak for transsexual people, no more than a single white person can speak for white people. There's absolutely no reason to assume that the activists who are performing in this room are representatives of any of the communities that they purport to represent. They have no legitimate representation whatsoever. So most of the transsexual people that I've had the opportunity to speak with believe that the kinds of demonstrations that we see here are actually not in their best interest at all, because they knock them out. And they're also afraid that being marked out in this way is going to be harmful for them as individuals. And as a general rule, they don't disagree with my stance on the gender-neutral pronouns either. So one of the things that I would ask all of you in this room is to think hard before you assume that noisy activists act for the groups that they purport to represent, because they don't. They have no legitimacy. I guess part of what I find it also quite disturbing that one of the things that people at the university are taught often by their activist professors is that coming out and protesting this actually constitutes a moral thing to do, because it's super easy. And part of the reason that I mean talking about individual responsibility while going all the way through this is because this is absolutely pathetic. And you look around and you see people in the room who come to university to learn and have been taught that this is actually the way that you move your political agenda forward or even formulate it. It's really incomprehensible to me. The other thing that you might think about, those of you who come to listen, is that this will undoubtedly be broadcast on YouTube, and there will be hundreds of thousands of people watching. And my experience has been so far that the kinds of protests that this is, it is typical of this, attract far more negative attention than positive attention. And so that's just as well. So So it's not such a bad thing to let this sort of thing play itself out.
Free speech. Hate speech is not free speech. Hate speech is not free speech.
One of the interesting things about hate speech is that someone has to define it. Right? That's a big problem because hate speech always ends up being the kind of speech that you don't want to hear. And it's very difficult to define it independently.
No free speech for hate speech. No free speech for hate speech.
I also think that when you watch people who are really ideologically possessed protest, mostly what you hear is noise. Because there isn't much difference between the way they think and noise.
No free speech for hate speech. No free speech. No free speech for hate speech. No freedom for hate speech.
There's nothing about it that's the least bit individual. You can't talk to someone who's in a state of mind like that. You can't make them want to run as individuals. People in the activist classes, they learn that they can memorize 10 rather appalling statements and learn how to make noise that actually constitutes a way to advance civilized discourse and to make it a positive improvement in the world. And it's really, they're being done a disservice by the educational institutions. There's absolutely no reason to get upset about any of this, right? It doesn't matter. I've had lots of chance to speak at different venues and to speak online, and I'm not in any danger of being silenced. And you really want to make sure that you don't let people who are causing trouble provoke you into doing something stupid. It's a big mistake, because a lot of people who are protesting and they're theoretically trying to make the world a better place are trying to provoke a very negative response. And you don't want to be the one to give them what they want. It's a big mistake. You don't want to wish.
No freedom for hate speech. No freedom for hate speech.
When I was at the free speech rally in Toronto, a lot of people have watched that online now. And it got pretty tense. And if anybody that was there to promote free speech had made a mistake and done something aggressive or violent and had it
Have a chance of
filmed
shame
and broadcast on
against
YouTube,
transphobia.
all of this would have turned out very differently.
Shame.
And so when you're in a tense situation like this,
No freedom for hate speech.
you really have to watch what you do, because what you do can be magnified greatly and cause a ripple effect out into the broader society. And you don't want to be. Unless you're aiming at trouble, you don't want to be a person who thinks that about it.
41% of trans were considered suicide.
I guess part of the question too is what do these people think they're protesting? The name calling and so forth doesn't really have much effect on me because I don't regard it as being remotely true.
This is where we draw the line.
First of all, they're very careless with their use of words. Like transphobe.
This is where we draw the line. 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 This is where we draw the line.
intimidated with you not being here. But, and I suppose in some sense, you can think about this as being shut down, but it isn't shut down at all, because, as I say, it's going to be publicized everywhere. So, just by sitting here and not being peaceful, you're probably doing more good than you could do any other way. That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I didn't really take exception to the idea that there's a particular group or groups that I'm opposed to, because I don't really get it in the face at all. I've dealt with all sorts of people in my life. You see, they got me confused with someone they hate. And the question is, who do they hate? Right? That's really the question. And also, why? And that's also something I'm trying to figure out.
No freedom for atheists. That's really
I think that's true. I'm not a Christian. And you know, one thing I do know from what I've studied and psychology is that once you start to regard yourself as a victim, you look for a perpetrator. And as soon as you look for a perpetrator, you look for someone that it's okay to hurt. It's really not a good thing. I had a student who toured the mass murder camps in Eastern Europe for Vienna. She was there during the breakup of Yugoslavia. She did a article on precursors to genocide. And one of the predictors for the eruption of mass movements that have genocidal attempt is the identification of part of the population as victims. And identification of another part of the population as perpetrators. Because as soon as you divide the world into victims and perpetrators, you can allow the parts of you that are the darkest to come forward and parade around as if you're being virtuous. If you successfully identify where the evil is, one of the things I always try to teach my students is that you can go look for what's wrong with the world. You should start by looking at what's wrong with you. Because you got there's plenty to fix at home. And the other thing I've learned too about what you can do to try to make things better is just start working on the things that you have in control, under your control, right in front of you. One of the things that's really nice about that is that if you're trying to fix things that you're going to humble them and for yourself, for your family, is that you don't get to come out in front of a bunch of people and pretend that you're virtuous, right? It's sad and it's cheap. It's sad because there are lots of better things to do. And it's cheap because it's a hell of a lot easier than doing real work, you know? And it's really priority. working too much. Can you guys hear me at all in the back? So, I guess I can tell you a little bit about why I oppose Bill C-16. I guess let's just be cutting out. Part of the reason that I opposed Bill C-16 to begin with was because I took issue with the manner in which the politics of identity are being built into our law. I look, see, so what I would recommend, perhaps, is that all of you who want to hear me talk, leave, go outside, and I'll come outside and talk to you. And then somebody peacefully, and whoever wants to stay on the sides can. But they're going to close this down, so let's try that, okay?
I think the most important one is that it's the first piece of Canadian legislation that's ever been put forward that actually requires people to use a particular set of words. Now, there is other legislation that does govern to some degree what you can't say. So, for example, you can't incite a crime, and that's perfectly logical. It's a reasonable restriction on free speech. But we've never had a piece of legislation ever that would require you to use a certain kind of vocabulary. And regardless of what that vocabulary is, and the fact that it happens to be about transgender terminology, hypothetically, is almost beside the point, as far as I'm concerned. You know, this all focused on this particular issue, and it had to focus on some issue. But this isn't the issue that's at the bottom of it. It's just that complex things manifest themselves in very particular locations, and this just happens to be the location that this is manifesting itself in. Now, the other thing that I really didn't like and still don't like about Bill C-16 is the surrounding policies that are basically part of what it's embedded in, that were produced by the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which I think is an appallingly dangerous organization, not least because they're terribly muddy thinkers. And so, one of the things that's happened that I think is reprehensible from a psychological perspective is that in Ontario and soon likely in Canada, we're going to write into law an idea of identity that's just radically insufficient. So let me give you some examples. So the way that Bill C-16 is currently formulated, if you take into account the surrounding policy documents, there's a proposition embedded in the law, and that is that biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual preference vary independently. And the fact of the matter is that's not true. And you can demonstrate it very straightforwardly. The first thing you observe is that virtually everyone whose biological sex is either male or female has a gender identity of male or female. In fact, the people who don't fit into that category, they exist, there's no doubt about that, but they're a very small minority. And the reason I'm pointing out that they're a small minority is because it makes the claim that those things vary independently false. And then you know too that most of the people who have a binary biological sex and a binary gender identity also present themselves in a manner that's the same as their gender identity and their biological sex. And so that's another indication of the non-independence of the three layers of purported identity. And finally, you can see too that the vast majority of people, for example, men who are biologically male, who present themselves as male, or who identify as male, who present themselves as male, are also heterosexual. 95% of them, perhaps 98% of them.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry, I just had a question. I believe it was explicitly stated to you that you should be staying off of those topics. We kind of want to hear your views on free speech, but we don't want to hear your views on gender identity and stuff. I thought it was made clear to you.
Yeah, we're no longer in that event now. We're outside.
At the same time, I'd appreciate it if you just stayed on topic.
I don't really think it's up to you to decide that.
Yeah.
So, anyways, the reason that I think that this is a problem is because it's written into the law. And the law isn't the place where you debate those sorts of things. You don't instantiate a particular philosophy into the law, especially one that's predicated on what I would say it's absolutely incoherent. And not only that, like even if you're thinking about it from the perspective of someone, say, who's homosexual, one of the arguments that people who are gay very frequently use is that there's actually a biological underpinning to their homosexuality. But we're going to dispense with that? Well, what happens if we dispense with that? What happens if we dispense with the idea that there's a biological underpinning to homosexuality? Does that mean that it can just be changed? And what are people going to do with that piece of information except try to change it? Right, the people who've been fighting for homosexual rights for the last 30 years very frequently made the case that the reason that the rights were necessary was because there was a reality to the condition. Well, I'm not arguing for that or against it. What I'm saying is that the law, the way it's currently constituted, makes arguments like that completely invalid. It does the same thing with transsexuality, which we don't know enough about it to determine, say, its manner of causal origin. Now, it looks to me like I think it's premature to exclude a biological component, especially because of what we know about how gender identity and biological sex are instantiated in utero. So we know, for example, that the standard human fetus has a female morphology. It doesn't matter whether it's XX or XY from a chromosomal perspective. And then it's transformed into a male morphology with testosterone.
Yeah.
Right, so... So the reason I'm telling you this is because...
Save your breath, we got all night.
The reason that I'm telling you this is because... There's no reason whatsoever to presume that the laws that are being put in place to protect the people that these laws are supposed to protect will do anything that remotely resembles protecting them. And as I mentioned when we were in the hall, when I talked to you about the letters that I've received from transsexual people, they're very terrified about all of this because the vast majority of them want to be as invisible as everyone else wants to be. And all this does is draw negative attention to them. They're also not very happy about the fact that they're being represented noisily by people who have absolutely no right to speak for them. So, one of the things we really have to get over, and in a serious way, is the idea that just because you're talking to someone black or white or transsexual or homosexual, that you're speaking to a member of a homogenous tribe, and that the opinion that they happen to have is the opinion that all those who are like them share. There's nothing that's more racist than that assumption, right? Because it means that they don't have to know a damn thing about you except the most boring part of your identity. And I can predict everything that you are and everything that you think. Well, that's a terrible thing to believe. And it's also patently untrue. You know, there's no reason to assume that any group of people who don't fit into traditional society for some way are any more homogenous in their general makeup and their political views than any other group. In fact, all the evidence suggests precisely the contrary. And there's another thing I really don't like about identity politics, because it's really predicated on the idea that the only thing that's important about you is what's most obvious when I first look at you. And that's an appalling proposition. If only you could hear
your perspective as Professor about censoring these topics and about why it's important to be able to have this discussion. You see right now, people are trying to shut down this discussion. So it's not, I want to know.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about why these attempts to shut people down are being made, because you need to know this. So, as far as I've been able to determine, this kind of protest is an expression of a philosophy that's grounded partly in postmodernism and partly in Marxism. Now, the postmodern element is basically this. There's no such thing as genuine individual identity. What there is group identity. And you, like it or not, only have the interests of your group. And the whole world is nothing but a battleground between groups of different interests. There's no dialogue. There's no possibility of talking between the groups. It's just a power stage where combat has to take place. And so the reason that speakers with whom the radical postmodernists and the Marxists don't agree are denied a platform is because those people do not believe from a philosophical position that dialogue can bring consensus. And all that's left if you forego that particular principle is this. And this is only where it starts. You know, the fact is that you're all pretty damn civilized. And thank God for that. Because if there were enough fools in the crowd, especially those who are intent on violence, this would turn out very differently. And we do not want to go down that pathway. It's a big mistake. We've been down that pathway many times.
If your belief, would you conform to it?
I would certainly not conform to a consensus that was against my belief merely because it was a consensus. Often the group is wrong. The question was, if there was a consensus against my beliefs, would I forego them? And the answer to that would be, well, first, it would depend on what my conscience said. What are we going to do? Assume that the consensus is correct? The Nazis had a consensus, right? The individual has a conscience, and you have to know when the group has made a mistake. It's nothing but a madly chanting law. In which case, what you should do is detach yourself from the massive chanting law and act like you've got a spy.
Jordan,
Yes.
you talked a lot in your personality class about confronting your shadow and creating your shadow. Do you find that people who care less about what other people think and care more about their conscience have integrated their shadow maybe more than people who care more about conscience?
Okay, so there's a... Can you hear me at all? You got it? Okay, so there was a question. The question was, stemming from my personality class, do I think that people are willing to abide by their conscience? Are those who've integrated their shadow? And I would say yes, because you have to be a bit of a monster to stand up to the crowd. right? If you're too concerned whether or not people like you, and if you're too avoidant of conflict, then you're going to crave at the first sign of pressure. And you don't want to do that, because if you let people stop you from moving forward, you just end up being someone who's stopped. And if you're someone who's stopped, you've got no life in you, and that's no good. So you have to get tough, but you have to get tough in a way that's controlled, right? It has to be controlled, because otherwise you're the puppet of your worst impulses, and that's a terrible thing to be. Other questions? The question was, had we called the police and had them removed, would have that been a failure? Right. I think the answer to that is, there's no point in it. There's no reason to assume that this is a bad thing. It's noisy and it's annoying, but that's fine. You've got to let things, you've got to follow what you believe to be true, right? And don't worry about it, and then let things happen. See what happens, because it's perfectly possible that if you're trying to do the right thing, trying to speak properly, that whatever happens around you is a partial consequence of that, and that it's a good thing. So we'll see. We'll have weeks after this event to analyze its consequences, and so far, all of those of you that are there to listen to me talk, you're peaceful and reasonable, and you got a chance to show that to hundreds of thousands of people. So good. This is a good thing, not a bad thing.
How do we get these people to understand that dialogue leads to consensus?
How do we get these people to understand that dialogue leads to consensus? You cannot make people who don't listen. You can't. They have to decide to listen on their own. But you do that by listening. You show them, engage in dialogue yourself, and consensus among you. You do it by example, because there's no getting through this. It's an ideological wall, and the harder you push against it, the larger it will become. Don't worry about it. But don't get pushed around, and don't let people indoctrinate you. There's clearly a liberal left bias on campuses. I mean, the documentation is very clear. If you go online and watch Jonathan Haidt's video, okay, he explains it. Partly the reason for that is that people who are higher in openness, a trait, are more likely to go to university and into academia. So there is some trait reasons, but over the last 30 years it's become overwhelmingly left-wing. Make your clubs. You know, you're not under the control of the professors at university. You're here to educate yourself. And some professors will help, and others will get in the way. But sometimes they can educate you by getting in the way. Right. See, you have an identity as a university student. You've got 4 years to turn yourself into an educated person. And the resources are here. And so it doesn't matter whether they're helping or hindering you. It matters what you decide to do. What do I think should be done about that? The question is, what to do about the classes of indoctrination that teach this sort of thing? And the answer is, don't enroll in them. Don't enroll in them. It's already falling apart. You know that 80% of humanities papers have 0 citations. No one reads them. And so we also have no idea how widespread this sort of thing is, but my suspicions are that it's maybe 2 or 3% of the population. Very tiny minority, but very well organized and very noisy. And so the other thing you have to do is if you stand for reason and you want education, is organize yourselves that way and tell the administration, right? So Say what you have to say. And in classes where people push doctrines on you, get your damn arguments together and push back. You know, but you have to be more articulate and more well-read and more better educated than the people against whom you're pushing. But that's your job at the university. Become articulate. And there's nothing more powerful than someone who is articulate. And no one ever says that at the university.
It's true.
Go into libraries and read great people. Write so that you learn how to think, and talk so that you learn how to speak. It'll make you unbelievably powerful. And that's what university is for. I can't understand why you're not told that. Nothing more powerful than articulate speech. Nothing.
You're proof of it.
Okay, so the question is, I've made the point that it's a good idea to let your conscience guide you. And the question is, what happens if your conscience guides you in a bad direction? And that can happen. I would say, look, if you want to rely on your conscience, and you want to rely on the sense of meaning that guides you, you have to make sure that you don't tell lies and muddy yourself up with deceit. Because you pathologize your being, and then it can't speak to you properly. So if you want to use an internal guidepost to orient yourself through life, you have to be honest, because otherwise you're going to follow something that's sick, and that's a terrible mistake. So the reason that you don't lie isn't because there's a rule against it. The reason that you don't lie is because you'll make yourself pathological if you do. And then you won't be able to trust yourself. And if you can't trust yourself, well, then you can have your political party and trust that, or you can have nothing. And neither of those things are reasonable replacements. Look, guys.
Do you want to speak over here? We can
should
form a wall.
stop. Okay? It went really well.